Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So delightful to see you all here today. My name is Julie Defise, and I am the Assistant Curator of Public Programming here at the museum. I am absolutely delighted to introduce you to our distinguished speaker this afternoon. Harmon Siegel is an affiliate scholar at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute, as well as a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. His first book, Painting with Monet, was published last year to wide acclaim. In its beautifully illustrated pages, he combines the pleasures of close looking and incisive visual analysis with a deep philosophical inquiry into the very nature of art itself. If you are someone who enjoys Impressionist painting, you absolutely must read this book. Alongside his scholarship on Impressionism, he has written and published widely on a variety of 20th and 21st century art and artists, including, of course, the subject of his talk today, Louise Nevelson. In addition to the intellectual depth and rigor that characterizes his work, a spirit of warmth and generosity runs throughout his writing. In his book, Dr. Siegel shares Monet's dictum that one should paint what you really see. As a scholar and writer, Dr. Siegel's gift to us is to let us see more and to let us see differently. And I have no doubt that we will see more in Nevelson's work and see it differently after his talk today. So would you please join me now in giving Dr. Siegel the gift of an especially warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was so nice. I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm going to jump right in so we have as much time for questions as we can. So I take my title from a quotation by Emily Dickinson. Nature is a haunted house, but art is a house that tries to be haunted. And I want to try and figure out what on earth that means. So I want to start us in 1958. Nevelson has just closed her breakthrough exhibition, Moon Garden +1, and she is given a feature profile in Life magazine. As you can see, she's posing as the Wicked Witch of the West with green makeup on her face, illuminated by a green light, and she's posing in her home with the sculptures that line the walls of her home. The caption says, like a sorceress in her den, Nevelson is peering out from an eerie world of her own making. Without resorting to eyes of newts or toes of frogs, she has conjured up a spectral sculpted landscape, which she calls the Moon Garden. Now, this profile would only be the first of a long line that would adopt the Nevelson as witch cliché. So here from the New York Times in 1976, there is cloistered in a secret Manhattan castle, a fierce, dreamy fairy tale goodwife in knit hat and flowing robe, who's been high on her own strange arts for half a century, a benevolent witch. And I think you'll agree that in this photograph by Richard Avedon, she's posing as a kind of madwoman. From Newsweek in 1977, countless associations come to mind, most of all, a ghost ship. The spirit of a delightful and amusing wood witch lives in this palace. So we've seen that all of these profiles are located in Nevelson's home. The one including the photograph that depicts her in her home, the next referring to her secret Manhattan castle, the last referring to a palace. And then in her obituary in the Washington Post in 1988, the woman, like her art, looked out of place in daylight. She thrived on shadows, preferred to work as witches do in the dream time before dawn. You're going to see a lot of pictures of her with her black cat, because I love it. And I see you have a cat exhibit, so it's perfect. she goes on to say, the obituary goes on to say, she kept her windows shuttered. Her house was mostly black. The polished floors were black. The table in the dining room, the cat, and the kitchen sink were black. Nevelson, who brought dead wood junk to life, ruled that dark and labyrinthine realm like some grand queen of the night. It's quite unusual for profiles of artists to take place in their home. And yet, this becomes essentially the dominant feature of all profiles of Nevelson from 1958 forward. Whenever they run longer than a page or so, they include the writer's visit to her home, which is described, oh, and by the way, every picture I show you, unless I tell you otherwise, was photographed in her home. The black and white ones in her home on Spring Street, and the color ones on her home on 30th Street. So it was described as forbidding, hermetic, an asylum, a prison. A visiting artist, Georges Mathieu, said there's no place to live, no living room, no entrance hall, no bedroom, no kitchen, no pantry, no dressing room, no bed, no table, and no tub. Yet one finds thousands of closets, thousands of cupboards, of chests, of coffins, of boxes, in short, thousands of Nevelsons, right? And of course, those closets, those cupboards, those chests, and those coffins are her sculptures. The next, by Hilton Kramer in the New York Times. Its interior seemed to have been stripped of everything, not only furniture, rugs, and the common comforts of living, but mundane necessities that might divert attention from the sculptures that crowded every space, occupied every wall, and at once filled and bewildered the eye wherever it turned. Now, as I said, right, it's not usual for profiles of artists to take place in their home. So, for example, Pollock, you know, his famous profile in Life magazine, he's shown working outdoors. The emphasis is on his body, his ritual action, this unusual performance he has as he paints, and then separated the finished work as a whole. Or Rothko, shown juxtaposing his painting with a sunset, or de Kooning in the forest, Klein with the city. So we might have an initial hypothesis. Why is Nevelson shown in her home? And the initial hypothesis, I think it's fair to say, is misogyny. The idea that the home is associated with the domestic, and this is a time period when female artists as high profile as Nevelson, because she was very, very famous and very successful, albeit relatively late in her career, that they would be associated with the domestic as a way of belittling them, of associating them with the work of a housewife. And there is some evidence to that hypothesis in contemporaneous profiles of female artists in magazines like Life. So here you see, right, the artist is shown lounging on her chaise lounge, almost more like the subject of a portrait than the artist who paints it. And her portrait is given, you know, it's associated with the domestic decor in the same way as the flowers and the grapes. And I think it's fair to say that the removal of artists like Pollock from the domestic it's not even just sort of a negative afterthought, right? It's kind of central to what their painting is about. Because as soon as you put a Pollock in a home, it starts to look like wallpaper. And this is a nightmare for these artists and for their critics. The most prominent critics, the most sympathetic critics to an artist like Pollock warned that it could become, as Harold Rosenberg said, apocalyptic wallpaper. There's an idea in a picture like this that this art ends in the home. And I mean ends in two senses. The sense of chronologically, right, that this is its destiny, that in order for Pollock to live, most of his work has to end up in rich people's homes. And also the end in the sense of a finality, right? That the work loses its meaning. In a certain way, it stops being art and starts being decoration when it exits his studio and goes onto the wall of a rich collector. So the claim that I want to make for Nevelson is that she is turning the home into the beginning and the middle of the art, not the end. She is making the work in her home, she is exhibiting the work in her home, and ultimately she is turning the museum into a home. And we want to understand why she is doing this. And we don't want to discount the misogynistic, explanation. It's wrapped in there. But that's not what I'm going to be focusing on today. I'm going to be focusing on the positive reasons why she might be doing this in a specific cultural context in which she lived, and in regard to that problem of modern art. It's ending up in the home and becoming wallpaper and ending and losing its meaning. My claim is that the home is essential to her work, not accidental. And this claim was made as soon as the 1958 breakout show. This is from the New York Times, Hilton Kramer. There was an important connection between the creation of her sculptural genre and her house on 30th Street. Between, that is, the original walls, meaning the literal architectural domestic interior, and what Nevelson had made of the interior, these sculpted walls. For the experience afforded by the interior of the house, with its pell-mell profusion of forms, its architectural division of space, and its twilight atmosphere, and there he's referring to Nevelson removed most of the light bulbs from her house, and she installed only very dim 40-watt ones, and in fact, she rented the upstairs to a renter, and the renter thought she was too cheap to put light bulbs in the entryway. The stairs were completely dark. You had to sort of fumble up the stairs. Its twilight atmosphere served both as a model and a given, the content, as it were, for which the form of the walls had perforce to be created. And indeed, this is a photograph of the 1958 exhibition, but the photograph is very misleading because in order to capture her work, and this is always a problem for Nevelson, how do you photograph these all black on black works? In order to photograph it, they showed the gallery in this bright artificial light. For the exhibition, Nevelson wanted no light. She wanted it to be completely dark. And when the gallerist said to her, "You can't do this, nobody will see it," she said, "It's not for them, it's for me." She knew what it looked like, so why should there have to be light? This didn't fly with the gallerist, of course. And so they came upon the solution of masking the lights with a blue filter. Like they do on Broadway, right? It makes black look blacker, but it still lets you differentiate one form from another. And the sculptures covered all the windows. There was no access to the outside. So here's the report from the New York Times about what it was like. Sorry, not from the New York Times, by Dora Ashton, who I'm going to come to again and again. She's probably the most perceptive critic on Nevelson. Entering that shadowed gallery, the visitor could barely distinguish the lined walls, various sized boxes with enigmatic contents. So we have this idea of the mystery, the enigma, and we have this idea of the two walls. They could barely distinguish between the walls and the walls. This is the review from the New York Times by Emily Genauer. She reports, Nevelson has long worked with wood, creating out of old box parts, worn shingles, geometric fragments, chunky abstract sculptures, suggesting barbaric totems, strange and frightening presences from a lost world. We may not at once identify it with ourselves or our own experience. The important thing is we allow it to envelop us, we feel it, still as a world we can enter along with the artist, a cave of the heart, a dark place of dreams and loneliness. And you'll notice here a kind of paradox, right? Because we're talking about the viewer entering Nevelson's loneliness. There's an idea that this is a loneliness that can be shared, that art becomes a way of sharing an emotion which is fundamentally alone, singular. And that this takes place, this can happen, this entering into one's loneliness in the dark place of dreams. The dream motif is going to be important. And then finally, I want to give one word to describe the kind of mood of all of these reviews and of Nevelson's sculpture itself. This is also a photograph of one of her exhibitions, not from her home. This is from Michael Fried. He says, "These are like nothing so much as coffins for giant bats. And there's no question of their working on us in less Gothic terms." And that's the word that I want to focus on. the one that unites these nouns and these adjectives: strange, frightening, lonely, labyrinthine, coffins, dreams, darkness, magic, shadow, witches. Okay? I want to unite these words under the heading of the Gothic, and the Gothic as referring to a certain way of imagining the haunted house as a mix of the psychological and the architectural. And it has a specific cultural meaning. And that meaning comes from a genre of literature that is epitomized by Bronte's Jane Eyre, but that also includes Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, and Emily Dickinson's poems are often understood in this way. And I do have to apologize if my friends Tara or Colton are watching this, who are Victorianists. I'm very much out of my depth trying to claim anything about the Gothic, but I'm not really talking about the literary Gothic, but about its adaptation in American culture in the 1940s through films like the 1944 adaptation of Jane Eyre. The two most famous and most important are Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca in 1940 and George Cukor's Gaslight in 1944. And these are absolute blockbusters. They are utterly shocking in how much money they make. And it's not an accident, because this is the moment when market research is invented. And this is the moment when studios begin to ask, who is actually seeing our movies, right? And what do they want to see? That's how we'll know how to make the movies that will make the best money. So they hire Gallup and they do polling, and they find out that, interestingly, most of the audience is women. In fact, when it is mixed audiences, it's usually the woman making the purchasing decisions for the household. And so you need to make movies that women want to see. And what movies do women want to see? They want to see movies about heroines trapped by murderous husbands in haunted houses. So we have Rebecca and Gaslight, and if you haven't seen one or both of these, I couldn't recommend them more. And then you have just endless remakes and spin-offs, and these, I would say, are in order the next three that I would watch. Secret Beyond the Door by Fritz Lang, which we're going to see some clips from, The Spiral Staircase, and Dragonwyck, but you could just go on forever. I mean, they just keep going and going. Notice the black cat. And you can see sort of patterns in these posters, right? There is often the house motif, right, shown on the poster, these sort of imposing old-style mansions. There is a sense of darkness, and that illumination has to come from fire and candlelight. And these movies share basically the same stereotyped plot, which I'm going to run through, and apologies, spoilers for films that are, I guess, now, 80 years old. A young heroine, naive, innocent, fresh, often visits a strange land, usually Europe, and meets a dark, handsome stranger. He seduces her almost immediately. They have a whirlwind romance, and before she can really get to know him, they marry. Once they marry, he takes her back to his ancestral home, usually an old castle on a bluff. When she arrives there, she learns that he had forgotten to mention a dead first wife, usually who died under mysterious circumstances, and whose things remain in the house as these kind of ghostly reminders of her presence. So in the film Rebecca, these on the left are all from Rebecca. They bear her monogram. Rebecca's the name not of the heroine, who actually has no name. She only is referred to as Mrs. De Winter. She's referred to by her husband's name. And so Rebecca is the only named woman. The only named heroine, I should say. And so there's a way in which objects in these stories tell the past. Objects become clues. as the trailer for the Two Mrs. Carrolls shows, right? A crumpled note, a glass of milk, a strange portrait. These are the haunting threads of suspicion. Okay. These movies are sometimes called paranoid thrillers or paranoid women's films, sometimes they were called in the time, because there's an idea that the movie is all about the act of interpretation. It's about the piecing together of a story about the past from objects in the present. And this haunting portrait, right, that is a genre feature. There are often portraits, and they often represent an ancestor who may or may not have left a curse. So for example, from Dragonwyck, this is an ancestor who committed suicide under strange, mysterious circumstances after failing to have a male child. Sometimes the portraits are even supernatural, as in on the left from Corridor of Mirrors, where when the heroine returns to her husband's home, she finds that he has a portrait of a woman from the Renaissance who looks exactly like her. Or on the right from the Two Mrs. Carrolls, when Barbara Stanwyck finally breaks into her husband's locked attic and finds there a portrait of her as the angel of death. It turns out that right before his first wife died, he painted her as the angel of death also. There's usually a female alter ego who serves as a mediator between the heroine and the house. Not so much the husband, but the house. And she's often introduced through a window or behind a curtain as this kind of ghostly, haunting figure who goes along with the house and represents its interests. So Mrs. Danvers in Rebecca is the ultimate one of these. Through a combination of the husband and the alter ego, the heroine begins to feel trapped, claustrophobic, tortured, like she's going mad. This is Gaslight. And the big question of Gaslight and many of these films is she merely paranoid, or is her husband out to get her? And so here we see her shadow looking up. What is she looking at? She's looking at the gaslight, and in homes like these, whenever you turned on the light in one room, the lights in the other rooms dimmed because there's a finite amount of gas. And so we get this term gaslighting, of trying to drive someone crazy, making someone think that they're crazy, from this film where Ingrid Bergman will say, you know, there's someone in the house, and her husband will say, you know, maybe you should take your medicine, maybe you should get in bed, you know. There's a secret locked away somewhere behind a cobweb door or in a drawer that must be broken into. You can see the husband finds out she broke into the drawer through the chips on the lock. And to find the secret usually involves going up or down a large central staircase. And in the kind of pop Freudian, pop psychoanalytic vocabulary that's often used explicitly in these films, there's a sense in which going up and down the staircase is ascending or descending into the subconscious. So staircase in Rebecca, staircase in Corridor of Mirrors, staircase in Dragonwyck, staircase in the spiral staircase, staircase in Rebecca, in Gaslight, and finally in Gaslight we see what's at the top of the staircase, which is this locked room. You'll see soon why I'm insisting on the staircase. When they find the secret, you know, the actress has the best time making, you know, the look of terror as she discovers what's there, at which point the husband will replace the subtle forms of torture with either locking her up or trying to kill her. And my favorite of these, which is from, can't remember, sorry. I think the Two Mrs. Carrolls. My Name is Julia Ross. They all have the same name, these films. From My Name is Julia Ross, right, we see this dark staircase. Don't worry if you can't see anything, because you're not really supposed to see anything. You see just the slightest hints of a staircase, and then you see the slightest hints that the shadow is changing, which is telling you that someone is on the staircase. Then we see a light, which is the husband removing the stair from the staircase in the hopes that his wife will fall into the gap and die. She doesn't, she never dies. And always the film ends in one of two ways. Either the husband's murderous past and plans are revealed and he is punished by a male authority figure who arrives to the rescue, or the more interesting version where it turns out the husband is disturbed, has had some trauma in his childhood, and the job of the heroine then becomes to do like a 5-minute psychoanalysis and uncover his trauma, and by uncovering it, fix it. But either way, she has to be liberated by the house burning down. And at a certain point, I can't really describe these films so much as show them to you. So I've chosen a few clips from Fritz Lang's Secret Beyond the Door that will give you a sense. So the setup here is that in this case, the husband is an architect. And he tells his wife that he collects rooms. He doesn't explain what that means, but then when they have a party, he brings them down to see his collection. And it turns out that what he means by collecting rooms is that he buys at auction objects from rooms where husbands murdered their wives, and then he recreates those rooms exactly where they were in his basement.
She was lying on the chaise longue, reading, when he came in.
Did he poison her?
Why? Oh, you mean the glass? No, that was wine. But if you notice the handkerchief on the couch, there's a little blood. It was a rapier thrust. In room number 2, the weapon was less conventional. The killer used the floods of 1913. This was the cellar of a house in Bath, Missouri, where the floods were especially severe. He was a sordid little rat.
Who was the victim?
His mother.
That's rather rare. Murder of a mother by her son. She's a brain psych major. In many cases, the murder of a girlfriend or a wife has its psychological roots in an unconscious hatred for the mother.
As I see it, the motive was common as dirt. The old lady was insured. He tied her to that chair. The waters were rising. You can see how high the waters rose.
Okay, so a couple things I want to observe about that clip. The first is, as you can see, they're never very subtle about the psychoanalytic dimension. And so here they have the woman pejoratively referred to as the brain psych major, explaining the basic premise of the Oedipal complex. And the hypothesis being rejected by the husband who says the motive was common as dirt. She was insured. So this shows you that these films sometimes take a kind of ambivalent position with respect to psychoanalysis. They're premised on the idea of the subconscious and often on the idea of an early trauma, which determines the way that we are. But they do have this sense that maybe things can be explained more simply. And this comes back to this idea of the paranoia and the mode of interpretation, right? How are we supposed to interpret the things in this house? And you'll notice the way the camera moves from object to object by panning through the room, and usually between one object and another is a shadow. So we go from the glass through a shadow to the rapier. We see the chair, and then we move up into shadow to the line created by the water as it rose. There's a sense in which the camera is meant to be identifying with the heroine's eye and with our eye, that when we are in these rooms, we have to take a moment to survey the room and to attend to the objects in it, and through the objects to reconstruct what has happened in these domestic settings. Okay, so another clip.
He spoke of an unholy emanation from this room, drove him inevitably to kill.
Pretty far-fetched.
Don Ignacio, it seemed most apt.
A pity for him that in his day nothing was known yet about psychoanalysis.
You think the room had nothing to do with it?
Of course it did. Very important. Something happened to him here. Perhaps in his childhood, and he'd made a resolution in this room to kill. His conscious mind had forgotten all about it, but...
But he still killed.
Match. But he didn't know why. He just had to. But if he'd been able to tell someone, like a psychoanalyst, what it was that happened here, no murder would be necessary?
Unless, of course, his love for his victims made it necessary. Now, our next murderer, compared to Don Ignacio, was a blundering amateur.
Now, maybe you get a sense of what the poster is about. And here I want to point out the relationship between the domestic as an interior and the mind as an interior, that we use the word interior to describe both things. And this film is about the idea that maybe the architectural interior, the domestic interior, shapes to the point of determining the psychological interior, that we can explain the disturbed soul of these men by understanding the domestic settings in which they lived. And I want to just take a brief digression to point out her costume, this lace. The lace costume is very much associated with the Gothic genre, to the point where, as you may know, Nevelson sometimes worked in white, and when she debuted her white sculptures, they too were understood in Gothic terms. So this is Dora Ashton again. She says, "The first thing I thought when I saw it is that Emily Dickinson, who we are seeing as this kind of Gothic poet, might have described such a place as she peered down from her wooden tower in Massachusetts. She describes it as Baroque finery, lacy and latticed like a small Victorian town." And in fact, before she came to her kind of signature sculpture, Nevelson was a printmaker. And one of her innovations in printmaking was to use lace as an inscriptive material, to burn lace in the process of making the engraved plate. But back to Secret Beyond the Door. He shows her his collection of rooms, and it ends in number 7. What's behind number 7? Well, he won't show us. It's locked. He says, a man has to have some secrets. As the heroine learns more about his first wife, whose room she now inhabits, she begins to get suspicious about what's behind this 7th door. And so she makes plans while he's in the shower. She takes his key, and rather ingeniously, she takes a candle off the mantelpiece, cuts it, uses the hot wax to impress the key, and then has it cast so at night she can go break into the room. Her husband, however, notices that one of the candles is shorter than the other. Okay, so now we're going to see the journey to the room, and I'm afraid I'm going to talk over the clip. So we see her descending the staircase in shadow. Notice that the camera is stationary as she moves. Notice the collection of objects that line the staircase. She's descending into his unconscious. Again, the stationary camera seems to omnisciently know where she is going before she goes there, as she disappears completely into shadow with only the beam of her flashlight to show us. She comes to an iron grate of the kind that usually is on the outside of a mansion, not inside of it, and looks for a way to open it. As she pulls it open, the camera starts to identify with her body and will soon become a point of view shot as she disappears into darkness. Now we have the point of view shot, the dark door illuminated by the beam, and notice the way the camera is following the beam, aligned with her point of view, until it reaches the keyhole. She passes in front a brief moment of darkness before she reaches her key into the hole. The music swells. Blackness, right, before the curtain is revealed. This sense of we are learning along with her what's going on, but we are also outside of her. We can't be hurt by the room that is hurting her. The light switch becomes the second key. We move the camera camera moves along with her as we learn as she learns what is behind the locked door.
It's Eleanor's room. The bed she died in. David is right. But no. This room is a copy. The others are actual rooms. What can it mean?
Notice the way our view of the room is guided by where she looks. First she looks, then we go there. And she opens the curtains to find that she is locked in. She is imprisoned and confined in this room which has no outside. Now we look for clues inside the drawers and open them up to find nothing inside.
The little things that made the room hers.
The little things that made the room hers are missing. Now notice on the second cabinet the way that the light has this transparent flowers inside, like contrasting the transparency of the light with the opacity of the drawer.
Oh, Mark, darling, you blame yourself. You torture yourself. You think you killed because you couldn't give her love. That's why the room is only a copy. You couldn't kill.
Uh-oh.
The candle. It's my room. It's waiting for me.
She's mistaken for the past what is in fact the future. She's mistaken the room that was his first wife's for the room that is hers. Now, I hope you agree that the Gothic is not such a far-fetched context for Nevelson's self-presentation, as in these two magazine profiles in which she poses in her dimly lit hallway. Remember, she took the light bulbs out with her work as she ascends into shadow. And in fact, she uses the staircase as a privileged site for the exhibition of her sculpture, making these kinds of confined, claustrophobic environments in which to put the work. Now, I want to focus, though, on one aspect of the way that she uses the Gothic, which has to do with the idea of learning the secrets of the past through domestic objects. This is a quotation from the first New York Times review of the Moon Garden show, the Breakthrough show, and this is not a photograph of her house. This is a photograph that I took of a sculpture. Gradually, through the encircling gloom, we identify some of the multitudinous objects, narrow coffins, shadow boxes, made like traps, and a whole host of objects nailed together that stand guard by a huge abstract reredos. This idea of gradually being able to see what's there, it entails a sense of duration and a sense of the moving eye that I associate with the way in these films the camera allows us one by one to take in the objects as we learn to interpret the room. Dora Ashton says, by using already turned table legs, and Victorian ones at that, doorknobs, bric-a-brac, she carries into her work a number of histories, mementos of personal histories even, right? The idea that she is using objects that all have themselves a past, that add together to a secret. And Nevelson says, I wanted to be secretive about my work. She's explaining why she moved from doing sculpture in the round to reliefs. And I began more or less working in the enclosures. There's something private about an enclosure for me, and it gives me a better sense of security. The press release for her exhibition, the 1958 one, says that it creates a world all her own where the major issues are the control of light and the secrecy of enclosure. And again, this is a photograph from the exhibition, not from her home. And this is picked up by the critics. So Ashton writes, her characteristic vertical boxes with their half-obscured contents and doors slightly ajar play on essential emotions. A door half opened, a drawer with a keyhole, a narrow window, things in short that symbolize secrecy, hidden riches or sorrows are always moving. And I noticed in the exhibition, you have one of these sort of coffin-shaped sculptures that has a door with hinges. And I noticed, I think it's the only one in the exhibition that has a label attached to it that says, "Do not touch," right? Because there's something so tempting about these doors that you want to grab them and swing them. And in fact, Nevelson kind of anticipated the way her work would be interactive, and she expected that in the dark people would bump into them and chip the paint. So every once in a while, she'd go into the gallery with a paint bucket and just make them black again. This is from Michael Fried's review. The best of her work amounts to the straightforward presentation of the incompletely revealed. And the sentimentalism referred to above, namely when he describes it as Gothic, resides exactly here, in the purposeful incompleteness and secrecy of her boxes. Looking into them is like glancing into an attic crowded with antiques through a door barely half ajar and swinging shut. The interest is in the secrecy and incompleteness. And I hope it's not too on the nose to show you the moment in Gaslight when exactly that happens. When the door to the attic swings open and we glance the antiques through the closing door. And Nevelson says, my work was black and it was all enclosed. I would use velvet and close the boxes. In other words, this was a place of great secrecy within myself. And I want you to notice here that there is a slippage in the language between the secrecy of the work and the secrecy of the artist, right? It's a place of secrecy within myself. The interior of the boxes, which we can look into and see this kind of half-ajar door, these keyholes without keys. This is, for Nevelson, a form of interiority related to psychological interiority, a sense that the mystery these boxes posed is the mystery of her. Now, I want to show you the clip from Secret Beyond the Door when we have the 2-second psychoanalysis.
Yes, lilacs have something to do with it. Search your mind, darling. There's something hidden in your mind so deep, hidden so far back, that you no longer know it's there. You're keeping something locked up in your mind, Mark, for the same reason you kept this room locked. Because you don't want anybody to know what's in it. Once you said you loved me. There's something hidden forces you to hate me, to kill me.
There's something locked up in your mind, something you keep locked up for the same reason you keep this room locked up. And as we saw in the beginning of the clip, it has something to do with lilacs. And we learn that he had a childhood trauma involving his mother, and now the sight of lilacs drives him mad. And that's the thing about these films and about the representation of psychology that they have. There is a secret. You can identify the secret. And once you've identified the secret, you can make the mystery disappear. So in this case, psychology, interiority, and the relation between those things and the domestic becomes a way of solving mysteries and uncovering secrets. Now, I think this is related to the form of interpretation that is so tempting with abstract art. Jackson Pollock saw a psychoanalyst, and years after he died, somewhat shadily, his psychoanalyst published the drawings that he made during their sessions. This sparked a vogue for interpreting his work psychoanalytically, as though there were a secret hidden within the tangled webs of his paintings. I should say that while the drawings from his literal sessions were not released until after he died, from the very beginning there was a sense that there had to be some secret meaning in these pictures, something behind the veil. He sometimes referred to the webs of paint as a veil covering up the figure. And if we could just see what was underneath, we would discover the mystery. And once we discovered the mystery, we would know what the baffling art meant. So that's one way that you can end an abstract painting, is to discover its secret, right? And then once it's ended, what happens to it? Well, maybe it becomes decoration, merely there while you eat your dinner to give some color or, ease the eyes or display your riches. Maybe even worse, it becomes the backdrop in a Vogue magazine spread for fashion, associating the kind of arbitrary changes in the fashions of dress with the changes in style of artistic work, as though they too were merely fashions. There is no mystery here. There's nothing to interpret. You don't interpret wallpaper, right? You don't interpret what's behind you at the dinner table. It's just there. Now, when the same things happen to Nevelson, it's different. When Nevelson appears in Vogue, notice how she's anticipated this, right? The woman in the green dress is just a belated reenactment of her as the Wicked Witch of the West. And notice the way that the shadow on the left, reinforcing her body, creates this kind of alter ego that I've claimed is built into the logic of the work itself. And so they are still referred to in the captions as enigmas. Or here, where we are seeing the models as these kinds of Gothic women in their lace against the backdrop of a deeply mysterious interior. And the setup for these photo shoots does not look very different from Nevelson's home itself. There is a way in which the destiny of art for the home and for decoration is built into the way that Nevelson designs her work. Imagine a cat with a Jackson Pollock, right? It's not part of it, but a cat with a Nevelson somehow is part of it, because the Nevelson exists in real domestic space. The Nevelson poses a mystery that cannot be solved, and that's where it differs from the Gothic film, because there is no answer and there is no secret. Nevelson is not posing us a mystery, a puzzle that we can solve and then uncover the secret. She is revealing the logic of secrecy itself as the demand for interpretation and meaning that characterizes abstract art, as halfway between meaning and nothingness. And Ashton put this as close as anyone has into words when she says, man, by which she means the human, is inquisitive, naturally endowed with investigative instincts, right? This is the basis of our lives. We are rational animals. We use science to discover more and more about the world until there are no secrets remaining, except at the same time, humans resist total knowledge. We cherish the last dark corner, the game of infinite puzzlement, right? Our lives aren't meaningful when the mysteries are solved. And one of my best friends is a theoretical physicist, and the first time I met him, I was like, what do you do? And he's like, well, I want to understand space and time, And if he understands space and time at some point, it's over, He can ride into the sunset. I can never do that with art, right? I will never be able to solve the mystery of art and then, say, okay, that was it. And that is why, according to Ashton, the human builds armoires with secret drawers, gardens with hidden bowers, doors with hidden keyholes. At his most unimaginative, he maintains safety deposit boxes. He needs to dream of shadows. Nevelson's work doesn't represent a door. It is a door. It doesn't represent a secret chamber. It is a secret chamber, but one where the only secret concealed is itself. Interpretation becomes potential paranoia, the endless search for signs that will reveal a truth forever out of our reach. That is what makes Nevelson, as she says, the queen of the black. That is what makes her the sorceress in her den. And so I will end on the triumphant image of her in her staircase.
So Dr. Siegel has agreed to take a few questions. I'll come around.
In view of the emphasis on the psychoanalytic, tell us something about her life. She lived until what year, died at what age? What significant relationships did she have? A husband, a lover, a close friend? What was the disposition of her estate?
Okay, I have a feeling that you know a little more than you're leaving on with the disposition of the estate question. She was born in the 19th century in Ukraine. She was a Ukrainian refugee, essentially, to Maine. She married very young, a guy called Charles Nevelson, whose name was the only thing that stayed with her. It was his name and their baby, with whom she always maintained a kind of ambivalent relationship, as far as I know. I'm always a little bit troubled by the kind of biographical in its literal sense, because I think with someone like Nevelson, she's performing a biography, and so the kind of interpretations that I want to make tend to be more on the side of the biography that she gives us through her public persona, and less through the facts of her life. But it is the case that she, like her mother, suffered severe depression. She was, as I think we would say today, bipolar. That's not a diagnosis. She was not diagnosed as bipolar. I'm bipolar myself, so I feel like I can diagnose her, though I don't think it's usually a good practice. She saw a psychoanalyst, and she hated it, and so she left after one session. But in her bouts of depression, she would stay in bed for a long time. Sometimes she claimed that her art came to her in the dark of her depression as these kinds of flashes of light. She didn't achieve real career success until her 50s, and she lived a very long time. She lived to 1988. Once she achieved success, she was incredibly successful. She was one of the most famous and rich female artists at the time, and by the time she died, she had public installations, gigantic installations all over the place, including a really incredible one on Wall Street. Her estate, there was a battle between her live-in assistant, who there's lots of speculation about her sexuality. She may have been bisexual or a lesbian, although she did say the phrase, quote, "If I were a lesbian, I'd kill myself." So there is a bit of trouble for me. I don't really want to go there. But she had this live-in assistant who got into a fight with her son about her estate. That the litigation, I can't remember. It was still ongoing when I wrote the article that this talk is based on. I can't remember if it was settled.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for such a thought-provoking and really fun talk. I really appreciate the way you sort of unfolded this genre of the sort of Gothic women's film. And it got me thinking about how a kind of parallel genre is often thought about, which is film noir, which is kind of, in a way, through your account of the Gothic, almost like the sort of counterpart to this genre. And in that genre, very famously, it's the femme fatale who's the sort of threatening menace. And so when we think about like film noir, it's often sort of understood within a kind of social, historical context of thinking about the sort of pressure on gender roles after the war, when there's this kind of need to consolidate or reestablish a certain kind of order around gender. And so it's hard not to sort of see possible strains of that in the reading that you're offering of this kind of counter genre. So I appreciate your resistance to solving the mystery, and maybe that's why you don't want to think about the kind of social, historical context, but it's so present in what you're offering us that I'm curious what you might say about that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're dead on. In the market research, these were referred to as domestic noirs. And there, the juxtaposition is the male is to the female as the urban is to the domestic. And if noirs are usually characterized by a male detective struggling to uncover a crime in which a key part of the mystery is the femme fatale who uses her sexuality to, lure him into a trap, the characteristic of the Gothic noir is often the just inverse, right? I mean, It is a female detective, not a professional detective, but someone who, throughout the film, is trying to solve a mystery, looking for clues, struggling against a male persecutor who used his sexuality to lure her into a trap. Yeah, on the social historical, I have no problem with the social historical. The way that the Gothic is often interpreted in those social historical terms is that during the war, women made up a very high proportion of the audience because they were who was left. And so the market research was in some ways sparked by this to try and figure out, okay, now that the audiences are all women, what do we give them? But in fact, part of what the research revealed was that the audiences were disproportionately women the whole time. And so when the war was over, they didn't get rid of this genre. I mean, after the success of Gaslight, it only accelerated. And so there's often an interpretation of these films as being about women's anxieties about returning to the home after the war, if we're counterposing a kind of Rosie the Riveter image to the image of the persecuted woman in Secret Beyond the Door, right? There's this idea that women have seen a glimpse of the outside. They've been allowed to exit the confinement of domesticity, and now they're being forced back into it. And so there's a way in which, if you wanted to do a kind of mass psychoanalysis or mass psychology, right, the interpretation would be something like the female audiences are sublating their anxieties about returning to the home through stories about heroines who are able to destroy their home.
So we have time for one last question.
I would like to know if it's true that Sondheim wrote a play for her. No, I thought it was Sondheim. That's what I read. I just wondered.
It was Albee, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to know for sure.
Sorry? Yeah, I don't know much about the play. I mean, I've read it, I haven't seen it. I don't think it's been on for a long time.
We'll do one last one.
Where would you put the works that she did in gold into this framework? I get the lace and the black. How about the gold?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see my interpretation as an exhaustive one. I think there are many interpreters. I mean, her work is multifaceted, in other words, right? I mean, never do I consider any interpretation I offer to be exhaustive. Not even the incredibly wonderful interpretation I give in Monet in my book, Painting with Monet, available on Amazon. The gold works, I honestly don't really know what to do with. I mean, they've been interpreted in relation to, a kind of recovery of the Baroque. For me, they remind me most of Robert Rauschenberg's gold works. He made works out of gold leaf, and Rauschenberg is a kind of key interlocutor for her. Rauschenberg's black paintings are some of the most, compelling monochrome black paintings, and it's hard not to imagine them being in a kind of dialogue about gold as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siegel. What a treat.
Thank you.